What's up, everybody? This is Sam Shady with Shady Sports Network, and today I just wanted to ask you for a huge favor. We're growing very quickly thanks to all your guys' help, but I've got a little request for you guys, and all that is to hit that like button. So basically, the way the YouTube algorithm works is if they don't see an asinine amount of likes on each video, we will not grow. We will not be pushed out to new viewers. So without your help hitting that like button, subscribing, clicking those notifications, making sure you hit like on all these videos, we can't grow as quickly as we'd like to. So with that being said, please help support Shady Sports Network today by hitting that like button. It's completely free, doesn't cost you a thing, and in turn, it helps us continue creating great content for you to consume in the future.
What's up, Broncos fans? Tonight we're talking about the active roster and the practice squad projections for the Denver Broncos. As you all know, I'm a Colorado native, born and raised. I might be an Eagles fan, but I figured I haven't seen a whole lot of roster projections for the Denver Broncos, and this was the time to do one. So, for those of you guys who don't know, teams typically try to break down their team into three sections. So, basically, you've got your specialists that always account for three positions: your kicker, your punter, and your long snapper. After that, you've likely got about 25 players on offense, 25 players on defense on the active roster. Obviously, you want a pretty even split here. You don't want to be offensive heavy, you don't want to be defensive heavy, and you want to make sure you have enough depth at each and every position in order to make it through the NFL season while injuries occur. So, of course, we're going to start on the offensive side of the ball. Everybody wants to hear about the unit that scores the points, not the unit that stops the scoring. So, we're going to start with, of course, the quarterback position. Something that's kind of been fading away in the NFL is the fact that teams used to carry three quarterbacks religiously on the active roster, with typically a fourth on the practice squad just to be safe. At this point, the Denver Broncos currently only have three quarterbacks on their roster, and I truly believe they keep all three of them on the active roster. Those men, of course, are Russell Wilson, Josh Johnson, and Brett Rypien. The reason I think this ultimately happens is because if you cut Brett Rypien and you expose him to waivers, I fully expect a team to bring him in as a third-string quarterback. He has played extremely well this offseason in the preseason. He's repeated this performance on a year-in, year-out basis. The Broncos have been able to sneak him onto the practice squad in years past, but I think he's just developed too much since being drafted in not drafted, in 2019, and he's developed a reputation within the building, and I believe the team really likes him as a whole. Moving on to the running back position, this is going to be one of the more interesting positions, and I think it's a position that actually directly is affected by the fact that the Broncos are going to keep Rypien. Normally, you see a lot of teams carrying four running backs here. Denver's got a little bit of a unique situation where they have a hybrid fullback / tight end in Andrew Beck. That's not really a running back. He's not going to aid you in the running game at all as a runner. More often than not, he's a pass catcher and a blocker and at the fullback position. But with that being said, I still think they only keep three running backs on the roster. Of course, Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon are going to make the roster. We know that's 1A, 1B in the run game. Williams tore it up last season, and Gordon did the same. Both of these guys were very prominent runners in 2021, and I believe they're going to continue this trend in 2022 and beyond, assuming Gordon sticks around in Denver. We saw him ultimately test free agency this year. He kind of sat out there for a while. Denver opted to bring him back on a 1-year, $5 million deal. So we'll ultimately see if he ends up returning after this season. It all just depends on how things go. With that being said, the third string running back is, of course, going to be Mike Boone. Mike Boone's got connections to our general manager and George Paton. He came over from Minnesota right after George Paton became the general manager. He was kind of the first player that Paton brought over. But with that being said, Paton brought him over for good reason. One thing you always want in a backup running back is ability to play special teams, and Boone's something of a special teams ace. He can play on the return team. He can run down on kicks and punts. He's very versatile in that realm of the world, as well as the fact that he can add depth at running back, and he's a decent pass catcher as well. So he's definitely a multifaceted back who makes a lot of sense to keep on your roster as the number 3. I was actually surprised to see Stevie Scott was ultimately released. He had up to this point led the team in rushing, former USFL running back from the Michigan Panthers, but ultimately they did decide to cut him. Currently, they still have 2 other running backs on the roster, Divine Azigbo and Jaquan Hardy. Azigbo came from New Orleans most recently, and then Hardy came from Dallas most recently. Both of these guys are kind of bottom end of the roster, practice squad type guys. Ultimately, I think Jaquan Hardy makes the practice squad due to his performance in the preseason. Ultimately, I think Azigbo ends up being the odd man out. We might see him in the XFL or the USFL this offseason, or this upcoming offseason, if he doesn't receive another practice squad offer or an active roster spot somewhere in the league. One of the things about the timing with the XFL and the USFL is that these guys can remain free agents during the NFL season and wait for a contract should somebody get injured on a roster and they get picked up. And then when USFL or XFL season comes around, they can continue to try and pursue being a starter in a lesser league and showcasing themselves to eventually solidify their spot on an NFL roster. I think that's a big deal for players like Azigbo, who kind of just needs that chance to show what he can do as a starter because he's a bigger back. He's not really too much of a backup. He's really kind of a bell cow type runner that hasn't been given the opportunity at the NFL level to fit that role. But I believe that if he were to go to the XFL or the USFL, a team's going to lean on him and he's going to showcase what he can do as the starter and maybe even get some looks as a third or second running back on an NFL team in the future. Ultimately, time will tell if he does end up in the XFL or the USFL, but he's definitely on my radar as a guy to watch for one of those leagues. Moving on to the tight end position, we have 2 guys here that are basically locks. We've got Albert O, a 2020 4th-round pick. This man was actually drafted in part due to his connection to current Seattle quarterback Drew Lock. However, Albert O is a solid athlete. He's a very well-rounded tight end, and now that we no longer have Noah Fant, he is expected to step up into that starting position. However, we did bring in competition for him in the 3rd round. Greg Dulcich was one of the guys that many people believed was the best tight end in the draft this season. I wouldn't go that far, but he's definitely solid. He's very talented. He's a guy that can definitely be a number 2 tight end right away as a rookie and push Albert O ultimately for that starting position. With that being said, as I spoke about before, Andrew Beck is more or less a de facto 3rd tight end. Being that he plays fullback as well, I still expect them to keep a 4th tight end, and ultimately that man is going to be Eric Sobert. He's a guy who's bounced around on Denver's roster for the past couple seasons. He knows the offense. He's familiar with everybody in the building, and ultimately he's played pretty decent when he's gotten opportunities this season. The other 2 men he's competing with, Eric Tomlinson, a veteran journeyman, who I don't believe is going to make the roster and is ultimately going to have to look to another team for his next opportunity, as well as Dylan Parham, a rookie tight end who actually made the conversion from quarterback to tight end at the college level. He's very raw, as you can imagine, given the fact that he made the move from quarterback to tight end, but he's got good size for the position. He's about 6'5", 245. He's a solid athlete. There's a reason why they moved him to tight end. They believed that he had a future at that position, and I think so too. However, he needs time to develop as a pass catcher. So with that being said, you stash him on the practice squad, you give him a couple years or a year to develop as a pass catcher, and maybe, we see him in 2023 make this active roster, or, he makes somebody else's active roster throughout the season as they need somebody to bring up due to injury. I think that he's going to be a very exciting player to watch over the next couple seasons. I particularly like to watch these bottom end of the roster guys because, again, we got the USFL and the XFL coming up, and these guys might potentially be the next stars of the XFL or the USFL, and it's definitely something to watch going forward. All right, moving on to the next position that is arguably the deepest position Denver has on this team in terms of offensive weapons, and that's wide receiver. Despite the fact that we already lost Tim Patrick to injury, I believe it was a ruptured Achilles. Don't quote me on that. It might have been an ACL. All I know is it's season ending. He will not be back until next season. With that being said, that does in turn open up a roster spot for one of these guys that otherwise might not have made the roster. And I'll get to exactly who I think is going to benefit from that move in particular. As the top three receivers, these names are guys you're going to expect to hear. Courtland Sutton, that's your number one. Jerry Jeudy, obviously the number 2 target currently. I know a lot of people would like him to ultimately develop and be the top receiver for this team, but right now he's struggling with drops. He's got a lot of room to develop going forward, and I ultimately think that it's only a matter of time before we do see him develop, but currently he needs a little bit more time to earn that number 1 target role. KJ Hamler, former second-round pick, same draft that Jerry Jeudy came to us at. It was kind of an embarrassment of riches to have two former second-round picks, a former first-round pick, as well as Tim Patrick as your top 4 receivers. It was obvious that Nathaniel Hackett and the previous regime wanted to spread the opposing defenses out and run the ball down their throat when they can't have as many linebackers on the field as they would like. With that being said, there's a group of guys behind them. There's actually 7 more receivers on this roster, and this could have gone many different ways. There's a lot of talented guys on this roster. Many of them are former draft picks, and there's a reason why some of these guys are going to make the roster and some won't. My 4th receiver for this team is a kind of a fan favorite after the COVID season a couple years ago, and that's Kendall Hinton. Kendall Hinton is currently in the Hall of Fame because he was the first wide receiver to play quarterback and start. So Kendall Hinton is I believe it was a high school or early college quarterback before making the move to wide receiver. He was pressed into action due to COVID hitting the quarterback room for Denver very hard all at once. He has since stuck on the receiver as stuck on the roster as a wide receiver / return man, and he plays special teams in many different roles. He's also a guy who could run the ball as a third down type running back in a pinch. He's definitely an offensive weapon type that can do a bunch of different things. It's just a matter of finding the perfect role for him. But ultimately, I think he is the 4th off the bench here, and that's going to be a pretty big role in 2023 with Nathaniel Hackett here. He, as I mentioned a couple moments ago, loves to spread out opposing defenses and let his quarterback take what the defense gives him, which a lot of times is going to be that 4th receiver because they simply can't match up with the kind of talent that Denver can put on the field. The 5th receiver and man who will definitely be pushing Kendall Hinton for his roster spot and his role is Montrell Washington. Montrell Washington was a 2022 5th-round pick. He is currently a rookie, but he has been handling the kick return, punt return duties. That is a big, big deal when you're a rookie. He's played pretty well in this facet of the game, and that in itself is a big reason why I ultimately think they're going to see him make the roster. He's had a couple returns. He had a long of 27 yards. He also had a couple punt returns. He actually had 55 total punt return yards with a long of 35. So he's definitely made an impression already on that side of the ball. But he's not without competition. Mike Boone has also returned a punt for 27 yards, a kick. And Jalen Virgil has returned a kick for 30 yards as well. He's got 2 returns for 60 yards. So it's definitely interesting to see this situation here. But Montrell Washington is a draft pick, so he's got that going for him. Most likely Denver wants to see what they can get from him in 2022, given the draft capital they gave up to get him. The sixth and final receiver here, there's two different draft picks fighting for this last roster spot, and I ultimately think one makes the roster and one does not and falls to the practice squad, along with another man on this roster that I think might be on the practice squad. The sixth wide receiver for the Denver Broncos in 2022 will be none other than 2021 sixth-round pick Seth Williams. Seth Williams is a guy who has definitely proven himself over the last year, but the thing is he had an upward battle trying to defeat Tyree Cleveland, a 2020 7th-round pick who's been in Denver for a couple seasons now. But with the fact that we have a new coaching staff, the advantage that Cleveland once had is no longer there. Seth Williams is a bit younger, a bit more green, but at the same time, he's also got a bit higher ceiling currently in his career, so I think that's what ultimately gets him on the roster. He's played pretty well in the preseason so far. Not to say that Cleveland hasn't, but I ultimately think Cleveland ends up being the odd man out here and lands on the practice squad. So for those of you guys keeping track at home, currently we have Jaquan Hardy, Dylan Parham, Tyree Cleveland on the practice squad. That's 3 of 16 players we need to fill the practice squad. The next man that I feel is going to fall to the practice squad is wide receiver Jalen Virgil. So Jalen Virgil is another one of those guys that's thrown his hat in the ring in the return game. He's played pretty well in that facet of the game. And with that being said, I ultimately think that is going to be the difference why he makes the practice squad. Unfortunately, we are going to see yet another USFL name released. That is Darius Shepard, former wide receiver for the New Jersey Generals. Brandon Johnson, a college free agent, is the only other wide receiver on the roster, and ultimately I think he is going to be released as well. Moving on to the offensive line. This one was fairly obvious to pick out the top 9 offensive linemen that Denver will keep. If you do the math, like I said, 25 players is pretty standard on the offensive side of the ball, which leaves us 9 roster spots for offensive line. Your starters are obviously going to be Garrett Bowles at left tackle, Dalton Reisner at left guard, Lloyd Cushenberry at center, Quinn Miners at right guard, Billy Turner at right tackle. These guys played pretty well last season, given everything that had happened. But the thing that I believe is very interesting to look at is all the depth that Denver has. In fact, normally I don't expect former draft picks that are within the first 3 seasons of their career to be released, especially if they played. However, this is a situation where I think there's one guy who's going to be an odd man out to see his name on that practice squad as well, and that's going to be Netane Moody, the right guard, 2020 6th-round pick. Moody played last season. He actually played 317 snaps, and he graded out with a 52 pass block grade and a 59.3 run block grade. He's only 23 years old. He'll be 24 by the season kicks off. But with that being said, it's just not enough to keep him on this roster that has a tremendous amount of depth. The thing is here, I really was thinking about keeping Moody over another tackle. However, Calvin Anderson and Cameron Fleming both have played extremely well in the past when they've been called upon. And another reason why you can afford to give up a guard here and stash him on the practice squad is the obvious rules that allows you to call a guy up from the practice squad up to 3 times in the season. That's going to be an asset with a guy like Moody who can still develop on the practice squad while also coming up when needed. Your backup left tackle is going to be Cameron Fleming. Calvin Anderson is going to be your backup on the right side. Like I said, both of these grades graded out fairly well last season. In fact, Billy Turner, your starter, 69.3 pass block grade, 60.5 run block grade, played 866 snaps at 31 years old. So he definitely was an Iron Man for Denver last season, but he left some snaps on the table, which is why Calvin Anderson had 172 snaps last season. He blew up the passing game. He had a 79.5 pass block rating and blocked on 97 pass block snaps. His run block grade was average, but I mean, when you have that good of a pass blocking grade, it's really hard to say that you want to get rid of this guy in a pass happy offense. So he had a 62.5 run block grade on 75 snaps, which brings his overall grade down to a 72.5. Still very good for a number 2 tackle in the NFL. Definitely not a guy you want to get rid of anytime soon, given that fact. But as I mentioned before, when you look on the other side of the ball, the left tackle spot, you got Cameron Fleming. Cameron Fleming's an 8-year veteran. He was drafted in 2014. He's been around the block. He's bounced around many teams. I think he started 44 games, played in like 97. So he's very experienced. Last season, he got in on 285 snaps, 153 pass blocking, 132 run blocking. His grade was a 65 in pass blocking. Again, not blowing anybody away on that particular side, but his run block grade was a 71.8, which brought his total grade only down to a 71.7. So again, very quality backup left tackle in the NFL, a guy you can count on in a pinch, and definitely a guy who doesn't scare you if he's called upon, and that's a big deal for your backup left tackle in the NFL. Moving on to the guard position. Given the fact that Netane Moody is not making the roster, it's reasonable to wonder who is going to make the roster. However, if you looked at Denver's roster, you know no other man other than Graham Glasgow makes sense here. So Graham Glasgow is a veteran guy. He used to be a starter. In fact, last season he started some games for Denver and played fairly well. He is the type of guy you want to keep as a backup because he's not only versatile, but again, he's a veteran. He's experienced. You know that if he steps in, you're not going to see a dramatic drop-off that will hurt your team, which is something that Denver can't afford to have because, as I've spoken about with them in the past, they kind of went in all in on this season. If you didn't catch the trade, they gave up 8 different assets to acquire Russell Williams. With that being said, if he doesn't come to town, maybe we're having a different discussion about who's making the roster based on them wanting to develop players for the future. But right now, they need to win now. So Graham Glasgow scored a 65.1 grade last season. Again, another 70.1 pass block rating, 61.1 run block rating. Played in 384 snaps at 30 years old. So he's not by any stretch done. He's got plenty of gas left in the tank, and he's definitely a guy who adds tremendous value to that backup guard position. He's a kind of swing guard. He can play both guard positions, and he's also played some center in his day, which is an asset as well because currently you've got Lloyd Cushenberry, who's only been in the league for 3 seasons now, and rookie 5th-round pick Luke Wattenberg from this past draft. So Wattenberg is definitely going to make the roster because if you expose him to free agency, he 100% will be on another roster. When you look at a rookie draftable center, that is not a guy you want to get rid of. They do not come around every day. So Wattenberg's a guy that I think Denver's going to invest a lot of time and effort in developing because they've had their questions about Cushenberry in the past. That's why we saw the belly, Quinn Miners, drafted in the 3rd round the very next season after we drafted Cushenberry. He was actually supposed to compete at center, but ultimately ended up at guard and pushed Glasgow to the backup position. So if Cushenberry struggles, there's always the outside chance that we see Wattenberg or Miners at center later on in the season. So just to keep track of where we're at on the practice squad, we've got Jaquan Hardy, running back, tight end Dylan Parham, wide receiver Tyree Cleveland, wide receiver Jalen Virgil, guard Netane Moody. However, we are going to actually keep 2 more offensive linemen on that practice squad roster, and that is Michael Neese, another guard with some flexibility, and Quinn Bailey, a college free agent in 2019 that's bounced around a couple times. He definitely has a little bit of experience, but he's a guy that we can keep on the back end of the roster who can play tackle, and if we see an injury there, we can bring him up. However, I think he would be the last of the offensive linemen brought up. If there was an injury, they'd probably opt to have an extra guard rather than an extra tackle, given how good Fleming is and the fact that he can play both sides, and same thing with Anderson. But with that being said, that's now, I believe, 6 players on the practice squad, and there's more to come on the defensive side of the ball. So, turning our attention to the defense. Starting in the trenches with the defensive end position, we're going to talk about the left end position first, where we have a couple of third-round picks and guys that are not going anywhere. We've got Draymond Jones, drafted in the 3rd round in 2019, the starter at the left end position, with Elvin Agim, a 2020 third-round pick, pushing him for snaps. We're going to want a rotation, given the fact that this is a 3-4 defense. These guys are two-gapping all game long, so that's very exhausting. You want a fresh rotation in there to make sure you keep your linebackers clean and let guys like Randy Gregory and Bradley Chubb eat on the outside. This pass rush has the potential to be extremely dangerous in 2022, given the players that they have on the roster right now and the depth at the position. It's going to be a near endless rotation of quality pass rushers in 2022, and I, for one, am certainly excited to see what happens for the Denver defense, specifically in the sack department. It could be an extremely exciting season, especially if Bradley Chubb stays healthy. However, even if he doesn't stay healthy, there's depth, but we'll get to the linebacker position here in a minute. I'm just super excited to talk about it. At the defensive end position, I think we're going to keep 5 players. The 5th defensive end we're going to keep is none other than rookie 6th-round pick Matt Henningsen. Obviously, we drafted him for a reason. We thought we needed depth at the position, despite the fact that we brought in starter right end Deshaun Williams and drafted Ioma Uwazurike. I hope I didn't butcher that last name, in the 4th round. That man is a beast at defensive end, and he is not to be slept on. I know he's a former 4th-round pick. I know there's another 3rd-round pick trying to get a starting position on this roster as a backup. I would not put it past him to see snaps as a starter on the right side opposite Draymond Jones in 2022. It'll be extremely interesting to follow because he had a hell of a season last year in college and showed that he can not only rush the passer, but he can eat up blocks as well. Your 6th defensive end right there is Jonathan Harris, who came over from Chicago. I do not think that Jonathan Harris is going to make the roster. 6 defensive ends is just simply putting way too much eggs in one basket, especially given the fact that you only run 3 defensive linemen in this scheme. So Jonathan Harris is going to ultimately make it on the practice squad. He's going to be, I believe, player number 7 on the practice squad so far. I'll double-check my math here in a second. At nose tackle, you only carry 2 men right now. I think they kind of showcased their hand here. They basically told us what they want to do here. So Mike Purcell, the starter from last season, got pushed to the backup position. But with that being said, he's a nose tackle. So there's going to be a rotation here as well. Your nose tackle is one of the key positions in a 3-4 defense. So they brought in DJ Jones, another experienced 3-4 nose tackle from San Francisco, who's going to be the starter. But again, this is going to be a rotation. I wouldn't get too upset if you're a fan of Mike Purcell. He's still going to play quite a bit, especially given that there's no other depth behind him. These guys are going to be kept in a rotation, so as to hopefully keep them both healthy throughout the year, because there's no depth back there. So that's a very scary proposition, given the fact that I just spoke on the importance of a nose tackle position in a 3-4 defense. If you don't have that guy to anchor the defense, chances are your run game or your run defense is going to suffer. Your inside linebackers are going to be eaten up by big old guards that are able to get to the second level because you simply don't have a quality nose tackle to eat up blocks in the front. And that's a huge deal for a 3-4 defense, because all of a sudden that opens up one-on-one situations for your defensive ends and allows your linebackers more ability to get blocked rather than having open field to run out the quarterback, because your nose tackle's eating up 2 blocks, your defensive ends are each eating up 2 blocks, and all of a sudden you're eating up all the offensive linemen with 3 defensive linemen. That's kind of the way that a 3-4 defense works. You let your pass rushers flow depending on how the offense wants to attack you. So, speaking of those pass rushers that I was so excited to talk about, man, oh man, do we have a rotation of pass rushers that is unbelievable this season. I'm not exactly a huge fan of Randy Gregory. I wanted Von Miller back in Denver, as did every other fan in Denver, but Von Miller got more money. So you can't argue with that. So Randy Gregory's younger, and at this point, his off-field issues he once had are no longer an issue. He's kind of cleaned up his act. He stayed on the field. And a big reason he ended up in Denver is because Denver was willing to take out offsets in his contract should he miss games. Dallas was not. They wanted the money back if he was going to miss time. But hey, they've dealt with his off-field issues up to this point, so I feel it's fairly justified that they were not hearing it, that he wanted all the money guaranteed and not taken back if he were to miss time due to off-the-field issues. His backup and a guy who started time last season because of Von Miller missing time was Malik Reed. Malik Reed is a pretty solid rotational pass rusher who I personally think on most teams in a 3-4 defense, he's your starter. At 6'2", 235, he's a little undersized, but he's a guy who's been able to stick around with the Broncos for a few seasons now, and there's a reason why. It's because he's a quality pass rusher. He's not necessarily going to blow any team away, but at the same time, you're not going to lose much when he comes on the field. He'll still be able to pressure the quarterback fairly regularly. On the opposite side, the strong side linebacker position, we have, of course, Bradley Chubb. Bradley Chubb is getting into that territory where he could very quickly be considered a bust. He's had a lot of injury issues the past couple seasons, and he hasn't really performed as well as we would have liked given who we had. I mean, he was supposed to be the power to the speed that Von Miller brought. Now he's got Randy Gregory on the other side, so he's supposed to be the power to the speed that Randy Gregory brings. So if he's able to stay healthy, we're talking about a very impressive pass rush. However, with the potential that both of these guys can miss games, Denver was not about to keep their roster at a disadvantage at the outside linebacker position, one of the key positions to make a 3-4 defense work. So they went and spent a second-round pick on Nick Bonito, a very, very quality pass rusher that came out of the draft. He was probably one of the top-rated 3-4 outside linebackers in the draft, and they went ahead and spent that draft pick on him. I think they did that strictly because of the uncertainty they have with Bradley Chubb. They figure, hey, it's a second-round pick. We've got 4 years of control on him. Bradley Chubb was drafted in 2018. 2022, they're going to have to make a decision on whether or not they want to keep him for his 5th year. So if that's the case, they obviously need a backup plan if he doesn't pan out. So Nick Bonito comes in. They add depth. They have a rotation now. Maybe Bradley Chubb's not forced to get hurt because he's not playing as often, which is a good thing for everybody. If you have fresh pass rushers coming in the game at a nonstop, that quarterback is going to hate facing you every year. And given the fact that we have a lot of intense passing games in the AFC West this season, they're going to need all the pass rush they can get. With that being said, they're actually going to keep a 5th outside linebacker in this particular situation, but he's a guy who can play a little bit of every position at the linebacker spot. That is 2021 third-round pick Baron Browning. So obviously, Baron Browning, as I just mentioned, is penciled in as a strong side linebacker behind Nick Bonito and Bradley Chubb. However, if you figure that he can also play inside linebacker, and you look at the inside linebacker position, it makes a lot of sense to keep this man on the roster. At inside linebacker, I have them only keeping actually 3 players, I believe it was. No, 2 players. Sorry, 7 linebackers. So that's actually Josie Jewell and Alex Singleton. A big reason why is, again, I believe there's other players on this roster that can play inside linebacker in a pinch. You know, if you were to lose Jewell or Singleton in-game, you have Browning, you have Bonito, you have Reed. Every one of these guys, I believe, could step in and play the position. They may not be the best option. You may want to seek out a free agent after the game, but With that being said, I think both of these guys, or all of these guys, can aid you if an injury were to occur and you were forced to press somebody into action. With that being said, obviously I'm mentioning that we're only keeping 7 linebackers, which means that there's a good amount of guys here that are not going to make the roster, including Jonas Griffith, Justin Strand, Jeremiah Gemmel, Kanai Mago, Jonathan Kongbo, and Jonathan Cooper, a 2021 7th round pick. So obviously we only have 7 practice squad spots eaten up so far. Linebacker's going to take a couple more of those. We're ultimately going to keep college free agent Kanai Mauga and Jonathan Cooper, the 2021 7th round pick, as well as Justin Strand, practice squad at this point, along with Jonathan Harris. So make that 11. At cornerback was a hard position for me to chop down too much. Normally, you wouldn't want to keep 7 cornerbacks, but that's exactly what I did. With the depth that Denver has, it's just simply too hard to pick an extra guy that I wanted to cut. So let's get into this. We've got Patrick Surtain, Ronald Darby, and Kwan Williams as your top 3 corners. With that being said, you also have Michael Onyemata, a 2020 third-round pick, former running back who's playing cornerback, who's played pretty well. He's also depth at kick returner, punt returner, so he's definitely a guy you want to keep on the roster because there's really a lot of upside to his game. He's still fairly young. He could eventually develop into a solid slot cornerback or maybe even eventually replace Darby on the outside. Another man that they're very, very happy with, very excited about, is 2022 4th-round pick Damari Mathis. Mathis is currently penciled in as the backup nickelback and not as an outside cornerback, but again, this is an early off-season depth chart that I'm looking at for these projections, so I'm going to go ahead and say that the chances are he's your 4th cornerback coming off the bench, or your 5th cornerback in this particular case. I think that he, as well as Isong Bassi, sorry about that, penciled in as your backup right cornerback who came over from the Chargers, and Fayon Hicks, a 2022 7th round pick, will all make the roster. So again, that's 7 cornerbacks. I know that's a lot, but there's a lot of talent at that position, and it was simply too hard to cut guys. I think Jaquan McMillan, a college free agent, also a nickelback, ultimately makes it on the practice squad. The odd men out here are Donnie Lewis Jr. and Austin Bless. I could see a situation where one of these guys makes the practice squad as well, but with the fact that we only have 4 more spots left, I think ultimately a couple of those spots go to people who are cut from other active rosters, and Denver sees a couple guys they like. I'll get to the other players I think are going to fill the 2 spots that we have left. At safety, we have Kareem Jackson and Justin Simmons returning as one of the best duos in the league at safety. Kareem Jackson is that leadership, that dog mentality that you need in a secondary. He's going to lay some dudes out if you give him the opportunity. Behind him, backup Caden Stearns, a 2021 5th-round pick, has spent some time learning this defense, and he is a guy that the Broncos hope can develop into a solid player down the line. Your 4th and final safety on the active roster is going to be 2022 5th-round pick Delarin Turner-Yell. Again, 5th-round pick, that's not a guy you want to expose to waivers. Chances are another team will bring him in and give him a shot. With that being said, that does mean that you're going to have to expose PJ Locke, a guy who's been on the roster a couple years now, on and off the practice squad, who's played pretty good this preseason, to waivers, as well as J.R. Reed, another guy who's bounced around the NFL and could potentially get signed by another team. I think if PJ Locke doesn't get signed by another team, he's the pick here for one of those 2 roster spots on the practice squad that I just spoke about. Getting to our specialists, most teams at this point have already determined which specialists are going to stay and which aren't. The Broncos have a pretty clear-cut situation at kicker and long snapper with Brandon McManus, again, the guy. He's been here for a long, long time, and he's not going anywhere until he starts to slip. Jacob Bobenmeyer is the long snapper. Again, he's been around for a couple years now. He's been pretty clutch. Generally, if you don't talk about a long snapper, it means he's doing his job. Typically, those guys only really get talked about when bad plays happen, when there's a bad snap, when he missed a block, stuff like that. But we simply really haven't had those issues since Bobenmeyer's been on the roster. And I personally think there's a reason why they didn't really bring in competition for him this season, despite the fact that he is a veteran and he's making a little bit more money than you would pay a rookie. At punter, this is where things get interesting. So we have a couple of veterans here. We've got Corliss Waitman and Sam Martin. Sam Martin played with the Detroit Lions for a while, and right now he currently has the inside track to make the roster. A big reason why is because he's averaging more net yards per punt than Waitman is. He's had one return for 10 yards, and that's it. But with that being said, he's also been able to average over 50 yards per punt, and he's got solid hang time, which allows his kick coverage team to get down there before the opposing team can really make any headway. Waitman has pushed him pretty solidly. He's got 4 punts for 179 yards. He had a long of 63, so obviously he's got a leg. However, his net average is all the way down at 39.8, which is not very good when you're looking at it. He's had 1 punt inside the 20. He hasn't had any blocks or returns, which means that his net average is fairly accurate. We don't have a lot of guys, getting big returns on him or anything like that. But at the same time, it means that he's hit or miss on if he's going to hit a good punt. I think that he's going to get stashed on the practice squad. And I know that sounds goofy. Not many teams keep veteran punters on their practice squad. But I think this is a situation where they have him still on the roster because they are unsure who they want to keep as a punter. And rather than give the job to a guy that you're not certain about, you keep one guy on the practice squad and you simply tell the guy, hey, look, you're the starter, but you better make it work, because if you don't, that dude's coming up next week and you'll be in his position if you make it through waivers. So I think Sam Martin gets the nod here because he's a bigger name, because he would definitely be signed, and I think Waitman might float through waivers and make it to the practice squad. If he doesn't, hey, no big deal. At the end of the day, you still got Martin to keep. Punting is he's been fairly consistent over his career, so there's no real worry there. Ultimately that is our active roster and practice squad projections for the Denver Broncos in 2022. I hope you guys like this video because I definitely had fun looking at the roster. As I mentioned before, Denver's got a lot of talent. They're a good team. I am obviously not a Broncos fan first, but I always root for my home team to win. I'm hoping they have a good season, and I hope they bring another trophy to Denver. We just had Colorado Avalanche win the Stanley Cup Finals and brought the Stanley Cup back to Denver. It has been a long time, over 20 years, and it's been quite a while since we won a Super Bowl at this point. I mean, we've been through a handful of quarterbacks. We finally have another legit veteran quarterback that can lead this team to victory, and I ultimately think that Russell Wilson is going to bring a Super Bowl back to Denver in the next 3 years. And I know that's a bold claim, but at the same time, if he doesn't, this trade quickly looks lopsided in Seattle's direction, even if their 2022 season is a complete wash, which I expect it to be. I ultimately expect that we see Seattle near the bottom end of the league when they come to record, but if they're at the bottom of the league, chances are they're getting a quarterback, which is the one thing their roster is missing, in my personal opinion. I know some people out there are fans of Geno Smith and Drew Lock, but I once heard an adage that if you've got 2 quarterbacks, you don't have a quarterback at all. So that's the situation Seattle finds themselves in. They've got 2 number 2 quarterbacks they're hoping can make a starting quality season out of. But I really don't think that's going to ultimately happen. I think there's an off chance that we see Jacob Eason play some because of how poorly everything is going to go between Geno Smith and Drew Lock. I could be wrong, but only time will tell. I'm just not sold on either one of those guys. There's a reason why both former second-round picks have been career backups since getting an opportunity earlier on in their careers to start. And that's ultimately because they simply didn't cut it where they were at. Like I said, I could be wrong, but I'm willing to bet I'm not. So with that being said, I am going to call it a night. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I will catch you in the next video. And as always, thank you for your support, and check out our sponsor, Upside. If you like to save money on gas, which, let's be real, prices are asinine at this point, definitely check out the app Upside. They're moving into the food world as well. You can now get cash back on your food purchases as well as your gas purchases if you use the Upside app. Use our code SAM363682 to sign up today